So we are in chapter 18, and so we have Lisa. So you're gonna take good notes for Fruma in case she doesn't show up.
You bet.
Good. And Rachel and Sarah and Bracha and Eliza. All right. Hopefully more will join as well, but this was a good start. All right. So we are in chapter 18, and what we were doing last week was explaining this idea of where in our soul is this chachma found? Is this love found? We're discussing the natural love, and we first said, how do you inherit a love? We officially inherited it because we have really holy forefathers, Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But how do you inherit a love anyway? And we said, well, it doesn't really mean we inherit the love. What it means is we actually inherited the soul. And because we have a soul, which is a piece of God, there's a natural love for God. And we said that love is for every single Jew. Even a Jew, all of our souls start on such a high point, and then they travel. And some travel quite far. But however far they travel, they never leave their source. They're always bound up with their origin point, deeply embedded inside of them. And therefore, every single soul, every single Jew can access the highest levels of godliness to the very level of God himself. Because in the core of the soul is this origin level, the highest level of the highest worlds, Chachma, seminal wisdom of the highest world, the world of Atzilus, the world of being. And embedded within that is the infinity of God himself. So if my soul started off there, because every soul started off there, no matter how far she travels, these are just layers covering over. We never leave our origin point. So buried deep inside is that highest layer, that highest core point, the highest level of the highest world, Chachma of the world of Atzilus, seminal wisdom of the world of being. And within that is the infinity of God himself. And therefore, every Jew naturally loves God as an expression of self-love. And then we said, so where in my soul is this love found? It's found in the seminal wisdom of my soul, in the chachma of my soul. We said there are 5 levels of a soul. Nefesh, ruach, neshama, chaya, chita. And on each level, the highest level is called chachma, seminal wisdom. And within there is this natural love. And then we explained at length this idea of seminal wisdom, of chachma. And we explained that it has the most place for God because it takes up the least self. It has the least parameters, and therefore God's most able to express himself and extend himself there. So that's the place in your soul where God is found. We also said it's unfathomable because it's not wisdom. That's why I'm calling it seminal wisdom. It's the source of wisdom. We said even the source of wisdom is the lower level of it. Really, its higher level is extending upward to the infinity of God. Its lower level is bending down to be the source of wisdom. So as such, in essence, it's unfathomable, which makes it very godlike because God is, of course, unfathomable. So again, it's the most fitting place for God's energy in your soul because it's so similar to him. And then we spoke about this idea of it being unfathomable, of God being unfathomable, of the seminal wisdom being unfathomable. And we said that's why in this place is the love, is the fear, is the belief, is the self-sacrifice. And all of these things are not predicated on understanding because one cannot, in essence, understand God. In other words, if God was found in a graspable realm of my soul, then how much would I get God? As much as I grasp, as much as I understand. But God is by definition found in that space that I can't understand. I can't grasp seminal wisdom, and I definitely can't grasp God within seminal wisdom. So as such, my relationship to God is not predicated on understanding because I can't understand him. In other words, it's not like, well, you understand more, so you get more. I understand a little less, so I get less. And she knows nothing, so she gets very little. No. For none of us does our relationship have anything to understanding. So therefore, that's not the contingency factor here on how much am I getting, how close am I coming to God. And then we quoted the verse from Psalms, Peti Yam L'chol Davar, Arum Yavin Davar Arum Yavin Davar Lashiro. A Peti, a fool, believes, and an Arum, a clever person, understands. So that seems to say, like, who wants to be a fool? Oh, you're just a simple believer. You want to be clever. You want to understand. We said, well, that works for things that are understandable. If something's understandable, you want to understand it. But God's not understandable. So therefore, to try to understand the ununderstandable God isn't going to get you anywhere. And that's why we said arum means clever, but it also means naked. Because if you try to be clever and take God on understanding, you're going to wind up naked. Arum clever, arum naked. You're going to be naked. Naked of this relationship. Because if your whole relationship is predicated on understanding, you can't understand, you're not going to have a relationship. So what do you do in that case? You be the Peti, you be the fool. What does a fool do? He believes. So for that which I cannot understand, let me be that believer. Because through being the believer, I can get God. And that's basically what we're up to. As the Rebbe goes on now to say, so we're on page Chaf Daled, the second page after 46, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, a little over 10 lines from the top. And in regards to God, who is beyond intellect, and no thought can grasp God at all. Hakol kipetium etzlo yisbarach. All of us are fools. When we're talking about God, the wisest man, and me, and you, we're all in the same boat. Because none of our ability to understand has any grip on God. And therefore, if we try to take him by understanding, we're going to have nothing. Because we can't take him by understanding. And now the Rebbe brings a verse to support this concept. K'dichsiv, as it's written, again in Psalms, Vani ba'ar, I'm ignorant. Velo eda, I don't know anything. Behemos hayisimach, I'm like an animal in contrast to you. Well, that doesn't sound very complimentary. But what does King David go on to say in this verse? V'ani tamid imach v'gomer, and I'm always with you. So here we are. Here's King David. He wasn't so animal-like, but okay. He's saying, I'm so ignorant. I'm like an animal in my understanding of God. And guess what? Because I recognize that, because I'm not looking to take God through my brains, I'm not limiting him to my intellectual perception, then you know what? Ani tamid imach. I'm always with you. There are no barriers. There's nothing separating us. But if I thought that my mind was the key to understanding you, instead of to believing in you, then I wouldn't always be with you. Because how much would I be with you? As much as I understand. And however intelligent, bright, brilliant a human is, how much can a human understand God? So that's that slice. It's like you're going to draw a little circle of, okay, this piece of God makes sense to me. All the rest I reject. Doesn't work. Doesn't make sense to me. So it can't really be God. But the piece I get, okay, that's it. So King David is saying, if so, you're not really with God. You're with that version, that sanitized version that you decided works. But if you put your intellect on the side, you say, God, I don't understand you at all, but I believe you. I'm like an animal. I just have a simple native belief. Oh, now you could take God. Now there are no barriers. So as we mentioned last week, this seemingly is a little bit odd in the book of Tanya, which of course we're focusing so much on understanding God. And we're saying, yeah, I can't understand a thing. You'll never get God by understanding. So you're like, okay, so what am I doing with this for? So there's really two levels of belief of God. There is a foundational belief, which is the antecedent, which precedes our knowledge, which means I accept. I'm accepting God. All that I do understand, most which I don't understand, is God. I take him on faith. And taking my faith, I have to do whatever I can to listen to him, to obey him. And one of the things he wants from me is to know him as much as possible. There's an injunction, there's a verse, Da es Elokei Avicha. Know the God of your father. So I have an obligation to study Tanya, to do whatever else I can to know God. Based on my foundational acceptance that I can't really know God, that I'm believing God. And once I accept him with belief, now let me use my mind to see how far I can go. And every one of us will get to the point that we don't understand anymore. Some of us get to it rather quickly. We'll all get to it. Or in this area, there's all those parts that are just don't work in our brain, are unfathomable because, hey, we're human. And when we reach those points, we ascend to a higher level of a belief. Not a belief that preceded my knowledge, but a belief that supersedes my knowledge, a belief that follows my knowledge, that as far as my knowledge can go, as far as my mind can go, at that point, I access a higher belief. And that's like the sandwich of my relationship to God. So I'm starting off with belief, I'm coming to belief, and in the middle, I'm using my mind to understand as much as I can. Any questions, any thoughts on anything we've said so far? Okay. Kiloimer, meaning to say, now the Alter Rebbe is explaining this verse. What do you mean I'm an animal and therefore I'm always with you? We're not supposed to be like an animal, but in this way we are. Kiloimer, meaning to say, Shebezeh shani bar, in this that I recognize that I'm ignorant, because we're all ignorant in contrast to God. Ubehemos, and I recognize that in contrast to God, I'm an animal. I'm probably less than an animal. Therefore, because I have that foundational acceptance and submission to God, because my desire is to be subsumed in him, that's why I'm always with you. And now the Rebbe comes to, if you will, the bottom line, which is really expressing, there's a very powerful chapter, because it's really decoding for us the essence concept of the relationship of a Jew with God and how that's different than anything else out there in the world. As the Rebbe says, and therefore, afilu kal shebakalim, even the lowest of the low, uposhe Yisrael, even the sinners of the Jewish people, it's not such a great title. Someone who didn't live a life for God at all, maybe from complete ignorance, maybe from complete desire, maybe from anger or rebellion. Lots of reasons why people do these things. But coming from ignorance, coming from anger, coming from desires, coming from indulgence, whatever the reason is, that sinner that we're entitling a sinner, Maisrim Nafsham al Kedushas Hashem al Haruv. The majority of them, we can't say every single Jew, because some people fail this test, but historically the high majority have passed. And when we say that the world was washed in the blood of the Jews, we don't only mean the righteous saints of the Jews, so them too. We mean the Jews, all stratas, all relationships with God. The high majority of the Jews that didn't live for God died for God. Of course, in the past we had ample opportunity, but it happened. And that's what's unique about a Jew and his relationship to God. That's what's a uniquely Jewish self-sacrifice. Meaning, as we said, self-sacrifice is not unique to Jews. I mean, lahavdil, the Muslim terrorists are also self-sacrificing for their belief system. The Japanese kamikaze pilots also self-sacrificed for their belief system. The early Christians allow themselves to be thrown to the lions for their belief system. So it's not like, Jews will die for God. That's part of the human condition. But what's not part of the human condition is that someone who seemingly doesn't buy into that belief system, someone who's not seemingly an adherent, who's not seemingly living it, when put to this ultimate test, is going to die for God. The question is like, why? Why die for a God you didn't live for? But this is the reason why. What we're discussing here is the reason why. V'sovlim enuyim kashim. It's not so easy. I died, 1 minute. No. They could have suffered very, very, very great difficulties. Shelo lachpor b'havaya echad. Not to deny the oneness of God, not even God, the oneness of God. Even if they were completely ignorant. They didn't know the greatness of God. So it didn't come from whatever, I didn't really live for God, but in the back of my head, I really knew him. So ultimately, I couldn't deny him. No, we're talking people that didn't live for God and seemingly didn't know God. And these facts affirm the Rebbe's presence here. Affirm the point the Rebbe is developing. What's the premise? The premise is our relationship to God has nothing to do with knowledge, has nothing to do with understanding. Our relationship to God is buried deep in our soul in a place that's beyond understanding. So some of us merit, we're fortunate to access this more regularly. It's like we dip into this sweetness on a more regular basis. And some people don't. It's buried, it's submerged. Sins cover over and over and over, layers and layers of transgressions, make it remote from us, this relationship with God, make it remote from us, our soul. The more sins you do, the harder it is to hear your soul talking to you. But when a Jew is coming to this ultimate test in his belief in God, that test is a direct assault on his chachma, on his seminal wisdom. And since it's a direct assault, it fights back, it wakes up. And when it wakes up, all of its powers, that core God, that is therefore the repository of love of God, of fear of God, of belief of God, and of self-sacrifice for God. Those powers are now awoken by this challenge, and they bring the person almost beyond his own volition. They bring him to self-sacrifice. And that's why the Rebbe says the majority of Jews that didn't live for God died for God. As unfortunately, we have many, 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 many opportunities, especially in the medieval times, especially in the Middle Ages. Now, the Rebbe doesn't say every Jew. The Rebbe doesn't say that because obviously that's not true. Because you could fight this if you really wanted to. But you'd have to, it's almost like for us, of course, if we're challenged to do the good or to do the bad, I mean, it's always easier to do the wrong. It's easier to eat junk than to eat healthy. It's easier to gossip than to restrain yourself. It's easier to be self-centered than to be selfless. So in general, in our life, to do the right thing is more of an effort, is more of a commitment, is more discipline. In this case, it's easier to give in to yourself and die for God. You can fight it. You can win and not give in, but it's the most natural inner urge. Just like it says when a woman's in childbirth, that urge for just to push the baby out. And you have to no, don't push now. Pant, don't push. We don't want you to give in to your inner urge. So it's like, you could fight your inner urge, but you have to fight it because the inner urge of a Jew is to be subsumed in God. is not to deny him. It's very interesting. You know, we're talking about Jewish self-sacrifice. The second Lubavitcher Rebbe, referred to as the Mittler Rebbe, said, he explained all those Jews that had died sanctifying God's names before his times, which of course was, I mean, he's already after the Middle Ages and the medieval times when, just as we said, the world was washed in the blood of the Jews with the pogroms and the libels and the Crusades. He said that all those Jews that died for God were reincarnations of Jews that had served idols. That until the beginning of the Second Temple era, such a desire that it's hard for us to fathom because we don't have it anymore, was a desire for idolatry. And of course, people sinned.
Maybe today money is our idolatry.
That is exactly what the Alter Rebbe writes. Sarah just hit it on the head. The first Lubavitcher Rebbe, the Alter Rebbe, Admor Zaken, says that God can't just take away such a desire because everything has to be balanced in this world. Now, others say, which is obviously not the approach of Chabad, following the same premise, well, everything has to be balanced. So how did God just take away this enormous, temptation in the world of idolatry? So others give the answer, well, he took away idolatry and he also took away prophecy. We don't see prophecy at this point anymore. We don't see the temptation for idolatry. So the world stayed balanced.
We do see
the Alter Rebbe doesn't follow that. Obviously, the Alter Rebbe follows that there still is prophecy. And the Alter Rebbe's approach is that he took away the desire to bow down to a graven image, and he gave us different idolatries, more subtle idolatries. And the idolatry after things, after money and all those things that money, is representational of, that's the current idolatry. So when you look at people that sacrifice their whole life to earn more, to have more savings, to have a fancier car, to have nicer granite countertops, that's a modern version of idolatry, according to Alter Rebbe, because that makes sense. Why are you giving up your life for things? Isn't your life more valuable than things? Goldie, are you asking a question?
No, I was just going to say that money itself is a graven image, if you think about it.
Absolutely.
It actually is.
It actually is.
So the dollar says, "In God we trust."
No, but Goldie's right. It's even a discussion among the sages. Can we use money? That's actually a discussion. The answer is yes. In case you're getting nervous, of course we have credit cards. Who needs money nowadays? Who has money nowadays? But when they didn't have credit cards, that was actually a discussion. Can you use a coin? Again, not a dollar bill, but a coin is a graven image. So is it allowed to be used? So the answer is yes, but it was a discussion. It was definitely a discussion, and it's she's absolutely right. But then truly, it's we can understand, especially of course when you see the more extremes, the more irrational, the more giving up one's life or sacrificing values like people for a value like things, we can understand this idolatrous end of it. But that, yes, Sarah, you're absolutely right. That is exactly what the Alter Rebbe says happened, which means that prior to the sages praying for God to take away this desire, people didn't worship money the way they do today. You could say, well, what could they have bought anyway? What did they have around then? But there always was some things, but they just didn't seemingly sacrifice it for life the way people do nowadays. But anyway, getting back to what I'm saying here, which is anyway a segue. So the Mittler Rebbe is saying that every Jew that died for God, post this period, which, starting from, we would see it, I guess, starting the first Jews that really died for God that way was in the story of Hanukkah. That was the first time we really saw this challenge until the time of the Mittler Rebbe, where all Jews that had served idols, which is in essence denial of God in the most overt way, and therefore had to come back to this world to give their life for God, to atone and balance out that act. Bracha. Bracha. But this concept that all these Jews did die for God really shows what's uniquely Jewish in our relationship to God. And this goes all the way back to Abraham, to our patriarch, to Abraham, to Avraham, because when he had 10 tests, there were 10 ways Abraham was tested and passed in his relationship with God. And one of the first was dying for God. He threw himself into a fiery furnace for God. But the 10th test, which was of course the most difficult, was the binding of Isaac, was Akedas Yitzchak. And when God is presenting him with this 10th and most excruciatingly difficult test, God says to him, Kach na es bilcha. Please take your son and sacrifice him for me. And the sages say, what's the please? I mean, this is God, this is a command. Take your son. And the answer given with Rashi, the foundational commentator on Torah quotes, is, I'm saying please, because I'm asking you to please pass this test. Because if you don't pass this test, everyone will say the other 9 were like nothing. Meaning, if you pass this test, it's not only passing this test, it's validating all 10. Now, what do the sages mean by that? What did God mean by saying, well, if you pass this one, everyone can see all 10 were legit. And if you don't pass this one, there's a question on all of them. So this is exactly in sync with the point we're developing here. If Abraham didn't pass this final test, this test that negated his entire belief system, he's 137. He spent a life trying to be God's spokesman on planet Earth, be God's PR agent, and giving the world a message that this is a kind God, a loving God, and a God that does not want child sacrifice, which was a very in thing to do in those days. The Molech was a very popular service, take your kid, throw him in the fire, very cool. And Abraham, for maybe 120, 30 years, has been telling the world, God doesn't want that. And now he's supposed to go and sacrifice his child for God. So what he's basically doing is destroying his life's work. Plus, God promised him that his son Isaac Yitzchak is going to be the father of the Jewish people. And Isaac is 37 and he's never been married yet. No kids. So if I sacrifice him, that means God's word doesn't count. It is meaningless. Is inoperative. Plus, his own soul, which was mirroring God because he was so close to God. Now, God didn't want Isaac killed. So his own soul didn't want Isaac killed. And his own soul was telling him, no, 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 no. So Abraham had to not listen to his soul, not listen to his voice of reason that says God doesn't believe in child sacrifice, not listen to, you're going to destroy everything you built over a whole lifetime of people that believe in God. You're just going to throw that all away? Your whole life's work? And many other difficulties here. In other words, what he was doing made no sense. Made no sense in terms of his understanding of God. Made no sense in terms of God in this world. And therefore, if he's doing it because a Jew has an irrational relationship with God. A Jew's relationship with God doesn't make any sense. But if he didn't do it, if he would fail this 10th and so difficult test that I can't even begin to talk about, I could talk and talk about it. If he wouldn't be able to do it, what he was in essence saying was, and somehow God made sense to me. Throw myself in the fire for God? Yeah, I believe in him. I perfectly understand. And therefore, this is a belief I'll die for. Oh, so you're like everybody else in the world. No, a Jew's different. How do we see a Jew's different? By this 10th test. Because here, when he's showing that his relationship with God makes no sense, is beyond sense. So not only this test, but all the other 9 that could have been rational, they were also coming from that same irrational base. That's what we mean that it validated all the others. We're not questioning if Abraham threw himself in the fire, but did he throw himself in the fire rationally or irrationally? If now he can irrationally serve God, he was always irrationally serving God. And that's the point the Alter Rebbe is making. It's not just the sinner when he dies for God, he's doing it because of a super rational relationship. All of us are serving God with a super rational relationship. Even those parts of our service that make sense, that work, that are in sync with our brain, that's just on the surface. The core of everything that makes sense is an irrational relationship with God, which is a very important point that Alter Rebbe is trying to make here. It's important that it's irrational. Almost as you could say, if my relationship with God is rational, then you could come along and challenge it. Then you could come along and refute it. Then a brain smarter than me could take it away. Here, it's got nothing to do with reason. Nobody could convince me against God because my relationship with God has nothing to do with intellect in the first place. It's because I'm a Jew and the core of my soul is seminal wisdom, which is super rational. And within that super rational seminal wisdom is the essence of God himself, which is completely super rational. And that's every Jew relationships with God. The Jew that understands God the most, the Jew that understands God the least, the Jew that's living for God every minute of his life, the Jew that doesn't seem to be aware of God at all. All of us, in the core of everything we do, what makes sense with us and what doesn't make sense at all, it's the same pulse. It's a super rational relationship with God. So going back to these people who never lived for God and who seemingly don't know much about God. The God b'macha yodim ain't by him klal. And even if we say, no, they probably picked up some Jewish education somewhere. They have some smattering of knowledge. Doesn't make a difference. Because when they're dying for God, they didn't say, there's a famous Greek philosopher that said, should I drink the poison or not? Give me 3 days to think about it. The Jews weren't given that luxury of choice. They weren't like thinking, well, yes, no, yeah, okay, I guess God is worth dying for. It's a knee-jerk response. It's the intuitive response of the Jew to a challenge to his relationship with God. So why is it that this Jew didn't live for God this whole time? So as I was saying before, let me try to explain a little bit more clearly. We have two forces inside of us, our godly soul and our animal soul. Every time there's a challenge to our relationship, it's as if a certain power on the animal is attacking the parallel power on the godly. Let's take the example of love. So love exists on the godly and love exists on the animal. There's a godly love for God, for Torah, for the land of Israel, for a fellow Jew, for a commandment. And there's an animal love for all the things we're not supposed to love. If we're being challenged, if the animal is trying to get me to love someone I'm not supposed to love, that animal energy is attacking that godly energy and like drawing it over. And sometimes it happens. Sometimes the godly wins and sometimes the animal wins. And that could happen in situation after situation after situation. And the godly could win and the animal could win. But the core of our soul contains the essence of God himself. Within the seminal wisdom, we said, is the infinity of God's powers. So that's a pretty hard thing for the animal soul to overcome. But it's not a big deal because usually our challenges have nothing to do with seminal wisdom. A Jew could be a complete believer, like cardiac Jewry. Believe completely, but don't live anything like it. So your seminal wisdom, your essence belief in God is intact. You're just doing nothing about it.
Can I just ask?
Sure.
Could it be that, our birthright is that we're like born with Amuna?
Absolutely. We are.
So that would that be what could help also push a person?
Well, Emunah, which means belief in God, and love of God and fear of God and self-sacrifice for God, these are all the powers embedded in the Chachma, the seminal wisdom of the soul, coming from the fact that within the seminal wisdom is God himself, is the infinity of God. So your love, fear, belief, and self-sacrifice are all these interwoven powers. And yes, of course. But like, why do you have this belief in God? Because you have the very energy of God himself inside your soul.
And that's like a gift to us when we're born.
It's an absolute gift. And that's what the Rebbe meant, that you inherit this love in the merit of the patriarchs of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, and Yaakov. Why do we inherit the love then? Because in their merit, we got a soul. And in the soul is God himself. And because God himself is there, we have these natural feelings for him. It's almost like an expression of self-love. So we naturally believe in God because God resonates inside of us. We naturally love God because God's the core of our being. We naturally fear God because we didn't in any way want to disturb this relationship. And therefore, we're naturally self-sacrificing because we'll do anything to make sure we maintain this relationship with God who's inside of me. There's a story with the Rebbe. There's a few different stories that sort of bring out this point. There's a few different stories like that. There's a story of a man who had like a basic relationship to God, though obviously he wasn't too religious. And he, I don't know if he was living with, fell in love with, was at this point engaged to a non-Jewish woman. And he sort of knew if he married her, he was cutting himself off from God, but how could he not marry her? So because he cared about God, he decided he had to say goodbye to God. And he went to some local synagogue, opened up the ark to like say goodbye to God because he was going to marry this woman. And he understood on some level the ramifications of this action. Anyway, so he's opening up the ark, crying, pouring out his soul, and somebody comes in and sees a man standing in front of the ark crying. He's like, what? Obviously, it must be a horrible thing going on. What's going on? Oh, you don't know that. And in the end, he told him. And like I can't help it. Obviously, I have to marry this woman, but I feel really bad. I'm saying goodbye to God, but I have to marry this woman. And so I guess the man that approached him in the synagogue was a Lubavitcher, and he told him he should go speak to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he told him a time and a place to stand somewhere in Eastern Parkway, that the Rebbe at a certain hour would walk past it, and then maybe he can help you. So he does so. I guess he really cared. He does so. And as the Rebbe passes, he basically said whatever he said. I mean, obviously, I wasn't there, don't remember the exact words. But the Rebbe's response to him is, no, you can't give up God. He said, yeah, but like in essence, what difference does it make? I mean, I care about God. I love God. I want God. But like at the end of the day, if I marry this woman, like what, us, what difference is it ultimately going to make? And the Rebbe said, it's going to make the hugest difference in the world. Well, why? The Rebbe said, because God's inside of you. It's not like there's a God out there. So there's this God out there, and me and him are not in such a great relationship. God's in you. You can't reject yourself. And if you do, like, you can never escape it. Like it's always, it's a devastation of self because you're rejecting self because God's inside of you. And that point hit home, and that point made him change his mind. And there's many other stories with the Rebbe and that point. Where that's such an essence point in understanding. Of course, God is everything. God is all. God is big and out there. And God's the pulse of my life. And the more we get to a realization that God is that pulse, then we live and not just die for God. But if a person doesn't realize that and therefore is not in tune, they believe in God in some remote way or not, but they're not in tune with it. So the animals all can attack power after power after power, love and strength and compassion and commitment. And it could usurp all these powers and pull them to the other side. But if it comes to a challenge of basic faith in God, what's now being attacked is seminal wisdom. And if the seminal wisdom is attacked, It's almost like it's sort of like sleeping under the weight, the burden of all this sin. This is, we're talking about people that sin their entire life. The Rebbe says sinners of the Jews, the lowest of the low. So the souls in exile, seminal wisdom is sleeping away, but now it's being attacked because it's not a challenge to love. It's not a challenge to commitment. It's a challenge to belief. Well, that's the power of soul that's now under the gun. Your very seminal wisdom, within which is the core energy of God himself. And therefore, since seminal wisdom is attacked, it wakes up. And when it wakes up, all those powers inside of it come out and fight back. And it's a really big fight, because within seminal wisdom is the infinity of God. And that's why it's hard to lose that battle. And that's why the majority of the Jews, a Jew who attacked the love, attacked the commitment, attacked the wrong this or wrong that, keeps getting pieces of the soul, pulling it over, hijacking the energies. But if we're attacking our very belief in God, and therefore God's essence power is now under attack and is awoken, it's hard for that essence, infinite power of God not to overwhelm completely a lifetime of sin. And that's why the majority of Jews who've sinned their whole life, who don't know God, or whatever they know they're not thinking about, they still, in that moment when the soul's energy is shining, give in to themselves, which means give in to God, because that's the core, self, God. They give in to God, which is self, and at that moment they're going to die rather than cut themselves off from God. So they don't know God. If they know, they only know a little. Whatever they know, they're not thinking about. And they're not dying because of a contemplative moment of understanding this is the correct thing to do. It's without any knowledge and without any contemplation, meaning they probably don't know. And if they know, they're not thinking about it, let alone contemplating it. Knee-jerk instinct of the Jew response. It's like it's impossible to deny God. The Rebbe has repeated here, this is the second time the Rebbe said it, Havaya Echad. Not just denying God, but denying the oneness of God. Meaning, if there was a situation where, like in Christianity, no, we're not saying there's not God, there's just a few other forces also. Am I denying God? I'm denying his oneness. I can't do that either. I can't do anything which denies the truth of God's reality. And denying his oneness is denying the truth of his reality. Without any reason. You can't explain to yourself why you're doing this. It's completely irrational, so you can't rationalize it. You can't pretend you're making sense to yourself. So why are you doing this? Because God is the force that's vivifying your soul. Being engarbed in the seminal wisdom, which we said is the core repository of these strength, seminal wisdom higher than understanding, higher than reason, containing God who's way beyond reason. That's the Jew's relationship. This is the final point the Rebbe says in this chapter, which is completely beyond reason, completely beyond anything which is graspable or understandable. That is a Jew's relationship to God. So if you wondered why you committed to something that you can't always understand and can't always explain, this is why. I mean, it's happened to me many times. People ask me as if I'm supposed to know all these questions about Judaism. Like, I don't know, never bothered me. I never thought about it. So now that I'm thinking about it and I can't give an answer, am I about to stop doing that? No. Why not? I wasn't doing it because it made sense to me. I'm not accepting Shabbos because Shabbos makes sense. Kosher makes sense. I don't know about that one. I don't know if it really makes sense. That's not a relationship. We accept God, who doesn't make sense to us, and subsequently commit to serving him in ways that are rational, in ways that are not rational. And Chassidus, of course, explains there's 3 types of commandments. Edus, which are testimonial commandments, chukim, which are irrational, and mishpatim, which are rational. So testimonial is like the Shabbos. It's a testimony that God created the world. Mishpatim is like, don't kill. That's very rational. And the chayk is like the laws of kosher, which don't really make sense. Or many others. Paraduma, I mean, there's countless commandments that don't make sense. So when we look at commandments that don't make sense, we say, okay, this doesn't make sense, but this is what God wants. And we look at something rational, well, this is rational. I mean, everyone officially would say this. And testimonials, everyone have testimonial concepts. Chassidus says, when we're approaching a mishpat, when we're approaching a rational law, don't kill, don't steal, honor your parents, if it's about God, not because it makes sense to me, if it's about God, we have to do it with the same relationship like a chayk, like a commandment we know has something to do with our brains, like the red heifer, the paraduma. Makes no sense at all. Man can't understand it. That's the way I'm supposed to think about don't steal. No, but that doesn't make sense. I understand why I'm not supposed to steal on a certain level. But as God's commandment, you're not doing it because it makes sense. You're doing it because there's an unfathomable God that has this unfathomable desire for you not to steal. And that's why you can't steal. It's interesting. It's similar with the non-Jews and the Noahide laws. The Noahide laws are very rational, right? Everything God is telling Noahides makes perfect sense. And therefore, there could be many non-Jews that actually, if they're very moral, upright people, are committed to all these things anyway. That's great. That's very great. But it's not making them a Noahide, and they're not keeping any of the Noahide commandments that way. Even if they know that God wants it, but they do all these things because they make sense, they're still not keeping the laws. To be a Noahide, you're accepting God's sovereignty. You're accepting his authority. And as such, you don't murder. And as such, you don't curse. And as such, you uphold courts of justice. It's interesting. The Chida was a great sage, a great mystic. And he was once speaking to a Noahide. Noahide is not a 21st century invention. He was once speaking to a Noahide, and he said to him twice a day, he should say the first verse of Shema. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, which means, hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And you're like, this non-Jew should say, hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, twice a day? But the Chida's point was, the whole premise of your relationship with God is belief in him. And therefore, you keep his laws. So twice a day, you have to affirm that belief. So you stay in sync with it. So everything you're doing as a Noahide is because the Lord is our God. The Lord is one. So similarly with a Jew, everything we're doing, even those parts that make so much sense to us, we're supposed to do irrationally because this is the will of God. So any questions on any of this?
No questions, but this is very empowering. It's amazing. Thank you so much. I missed the classes from the last couple times.
Glad you're able to come back, Rachel.
Yeah.
It's been, it takes a while to decompress from Pesach. So glad.
No, we're traveling.
No, we're traveling and moving.
Oh,
And,
I know you're moving, but you're traveling and you're moving. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, hard to do both at once.
exactly.
Well, thank you very much. And anybody that has something to share, we generally try to share some miracle, some thank you to God that we've experienced over this week.
Well, it's something like we don't think about so much. But Erev Shabbos, I was like rushing, my history, and I got 2 cuts, one on each hand. One like I reached in a drawer and like this peeler cut me, and the other I got poked with something. So you know, they were hurting, but then all of a sudden they started getting better. And there's not much of a, you know, I can't really see it. And I was just thinking how miraculous Hashem is. It's a little thing. It's just like a couple of cuts on your hand. But I was thinking how every day it you know, got better and then it disappeared. I mean, it's
You're
a dumb,
so right. I understand what you're saying, because
it's
so
a
many
dumb
things
little
just
thing,
like
but you know,
work out. It just works out. I like, you know, we forget because it worked out. When we're really frustrated and things don't work out and then they work out, we remember a little. But when it just works out, we sometimes forget to pause and appreciate and say thank you.
so, Baruch Hashem,
Absolutely.
it's just, sometimes it's very, like, to me, getting older, it just feels very precious, like stopping and realizing to be grateful for even a cut healing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And
I had an experience that that I felt was so connected with what we were learning last week. And so it's kind of cool when you are learning something and you kind of feel it, like when you bring it into real life. It's like part of your experience. So it was very interesting. I stopped in the dollar store just to get, you know, I left Hint in the car, just got a few things. And there was very, very, very long line. And I think because when you are a parent of a special needs child, you just like automatically speak up. You get this ability to speak up. So I just like walked up to the cashier and I said, you know, there's a really long line. Is there any way I can open up another cash register? So whatever. Anyway, it was a small thing, but what ended up happening was they said, oh, you know, the other lady's on break and whatever. So I went back to the line and a couple of the people in the line were kind of, what did they say? Whatever. So I said, well, you know, person's whatever. I gave one of them Sheva Mitzvah card. So at least you have something positive while you're waiting. Then I gave the other one Sheva Mitzvah card, and they said, well, I'm Jewish. And, you know, I was actually born on Yom Kippur. And I said, well, then that's not really for you. But she was in a bad way and was living in a car. I know she's in a bad way right now. But anyway, I told her, like, she needs to pray to God. Like, that's what you have to do when things are hard. And I got for her some of the, you know, the little lights that you could just, you know, flip on, like they use in, like Rabbi Wolf uses in the, yeah, where they're not in the hospitals, where they're not, you know, they're not fire. You know, so anyway, what ended up happening is the other register did open up, and what ended up happening is that this lady that was in a, you know, basically homeless, but she couldn't pay for whatever she was getting. I don't know, it's $5, which she was short. It wasn't on her debit, whatever card she had, her food stamp card, it wasn't working. And so someone came up in the line and they paid for her. And she was very emotional. And they said to her, well, you know, that's what we have to do. We have to take care of the elderly, or whatever it was. But I really felt like the lesson that you said last week was that, no, I didn't go to everybody and I didn't give everybody the Sheva Mitzvah card, but I really felt like when a Jew does what's right, like you just create a certain energy of godliness, and it affects the whole world around you. And, you know, I'm not saying it was my direct whatever, it just felt like there was an association that either I got to see that for myself, that kindness, like how the world is transforming, or that just the energy of when we're doing what's right, we are transforming the world, whichever way you want to flip it. But I thought it was very connected to what you taught last week. So I just wanted to share that.
You're right. It's nice you're able to see it. It's nice, Hashem, like we do it all the time, but it's nice when we can see it. When we see like that strong, like it's nice you were still in the store when that happened. that you were able to see it. It really is. That's very beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Anyone else have something they'd like to share from this week? And they'd like to thank God for something, a miracle, small or big, that occurred in their life. I'd like to thank Hashem for the nachas. This weekend was my son's inauguration of the mikveh that they built in Springfield. And I really didn't want to go down. I'm so bogged down, so busy, like everyone. And, you know, but obviously he wants us to come, and we came. We did it, whatever. And, now in my head, I'm like, you know, I was just, whatever, you know. And it's not even like his real event is virtual for his community. So this is the unofficial covert opening. And I had so much nachas. It was so beautiful to see this beautiful mikveh that they built, which I've seen before, but it was so powerful to see it. And it was so powerful. He had this video of 4 different women in his community all talking about, you know, they're going to use this mikveh. And I was like, wow, he hasn't even opened it up, and he has 4 women, obviously none of them are religious at all, and they all really want to use this mikveh on some level. It was very, very touching. And I think that also speaks to what we're saying in this class, that, you know, there's that piece of the Jew that just something about God is going to resonate, and maybe it's through mikveh that they're just going to hear the voice of God inside of them. But I want to thank Hashem. It was a tremendous amount of nachas.
Mazel tov.
Thank
It's
you.
beautiful. It's beautiful.
Yeah, it was. I always appreciate the nachas, even if I'm complaining the whole way I'm going there. Anyone else have something to share? Okay, so this week is Achri Mos Kedoshim. And Achri Mos Kedoshim is where the Rebbe develops at length this idea of Goyla Geula. It's not an innovation of the talk, but it's developed at length this concept. Goyla means exile. Geula means redemption. And what's sort of weird, the Rebbe points out, is that the word redemption is the exact same letters as the word exile, Goyla Geula, plus 1 letter. Goyla plus 1 letter is Geula, and that letter is an aleph. The aleph, the Rebbe says, stands for Alufo Shel Olam, God as master of the world. So when we take God and we insert him into exile, we create redemption. And then the Rebbe says, okay, that's cool. But why is that the name redemption? Like it's a true concept, but the name of something is reflecting its essence. So why is the essence of redemption exile plus the aleph for God? And the Rebbe says because redemption is exile uncovered, exile godly, exile done right. Meaning it's not like, well, there's this world of exile, and if we do enough good deeds, poof, we come to this thing called redemption. No. The world of redemption is the world of exile, with God uncovered in it, with God revealed in it. And that's the essence, definition of redemption. A physical world that's expressing itself as a godly world. And the Rebbe connects this to the ethics of the fathers, the Pirkei Avos for this week, which is chapter 3, where we're told, look at 3 things and you shall not come to sin. There are questions, why do we need that phrase? This is a Mishnah, it's supposed to be very short, cryptic. What 3 things are we talking about here? The Rebbe says we're talking about you, God, and the world. Meaning a person could think, oh, there's 2 things of importance, me and God, and our relationship. No, there's you, there's God, and there's a world. Because God put you in a world to give that world back to God. And that's why the word for redemption is exile. because we're not supposed to like ignore the world and be godly and holy and whatever. No, God gave us the world. God wants this world. And through this world, we're supposed to reveal God. And that's the essence of redemption. And I think we've been doing it quite well and for many, 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 many years. So I'm sure God has his world above and beyond. And he should just finish off the job of anything we haven't done and uncover himself in this world already. And we should have the Geula now. Thank you so much for joining. I know it's hard. I know we're busy. I know we're tired. So thank you so much for joining. And we should have a wonderful, amazing week where we really see God uncovered in this world and see the complete
Amen.
revelation of Mashiach now.
Amen.
And
Thank you so
Especially
much.
now.
Carol.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you
Thank
so
you.
much. Have a good night.
Have a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful week.